The fiddle's last note hung in the mountain air like a prayer, and Rachel Harris felt every eye in the valley watching as Charles Rivera extended his weathered hand toward her. The bonfire cast dancing shadows across the faces of the townspeople who had gathered for the harvest celebration, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed mockery. Rachel's left leg, twisted from birth into an awkward angle that made her gait uneven and uncertain, seemed to throb with the weight of their stares. "I don't dance," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames and the murmur of conversations that had suddenly grown quieter, more pointed. Charles didn't withdraw his hand. His dark eyes, weathered by years in the high country, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Neither do I, properly speaking," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down mountain storms and hungry wolves. "But I figure we might work something out together." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Mrs. Henderson from the general store tittered behind her fan and Rachel caught the words, "poor thing" and "making a spectacle," carried on the evening breeze. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and she started to turn away, to flee back to the safety of her cabin where no one could see her struggle. But Charles stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring as the mountain itself. "Rachel," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her look up again. "You move perfectly with me." Those words, spoken with such quiet conviction, would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. But this moment, this choice was still 3 months in the making. It had been early September when the first snows came to the high country, weeks earlier than anyone expected. Rachel Harris stood at the window of her small cabin, watching the white curtain descend across the valley with growing unease. At 26, she had lived through enough mountain winters to know that early snow meant a hard season ahead, and her supplies were nowhere near adequate. The limp that marked her left leg made the simple task of gathering firewood an exhausting ordeal. Her father had built the cabin in this remote location specifically to shield her from the curious and often cruel eyes of the townspeople, but his death 2 winters ago had left her struggling to maintain the isolation that had once protected her. The sound of an axe biting into wood echoed across the valley, sharp and rhythmic in the thin mountain air. Rachel pressed her face to the cold glass, trying to locate the source. Someone was cutting wood nearby, which seemed impossible. The nearest neighbor was old Henrik Johansson, and his place was a good 3 miles down the valley. The chopping continued for the better part of an hour, then stopped abruptly. Then she heard something that made her heart race, the crunch of footsteps approaching through the snow. 3 measured knocks echoed through the small cabin. Not the frantic pounding of someone in distress, nor the aggressive hammering of someone with ill intent, but the steady, respectful knock of a neighbor. "Who's there?" she called out. "Name's Charles Rivera," came the reply, spoken in a deep voice that carried a slight accent. "I've been clearing deadfall from the creek up above your place. Thought you might be interested in some of the wood I've been cutting." Rachel hesitated. She had never heard the name Charles Rivera. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you wouldn't. I've got a place up in the high country, about 10 miles north of here. I don't come down to the valley much, but I've been working the watershed this fall." The explanation made sense, but caution held her back. "Why would you offer me wood?" she asked. There was a pause before he answered. "I've seen you making trips to your wood pile. Looks like hard work for you. I've got more wood than I can use, and it seemed neighborly to offer." The simple kindness in his words, delivered without pity or condescension, caught her off guard. "You can leave it by the wood pile," she said. "I'll pay you for it when I can get to town." "No need for payment. Consider it a trade. I'll clear the deadfall from your section of creek, and you let me know if you see any signs of the big cat that's been working this area." A mountain lion. That explained why her chickens had been restless lately. "I haven't seen a cat," she said, "but my chickens have been acting strange." "That's good information. I'll set some snares around your place if you don't mind." "All right, you can leave the wood by the pile." She heard his footsteps moving away from the door, then the sound of wood being stacked. When the sound stopped, she heard his voice again. "I'll check those snares in a few days. If you need anything before then, there's a bell hanging from the big pine about 100 yards up the creek. Ring it 3 times, and I'll hear it up at my place." Over the following days, as the snow continued to fall, Rachel found herself thinking about her mysterious neighbor. True to his word, he had set snares around her property, checking them regularly but never approaching the cabin directly. She caught glimpses of him occasionally, a tall figure moving through the trees with easy confidence. The mountain lion struck on the fourth night. Rachel woke to the sound of her chickens in distress, their panicked squawking cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. By the time she managed to light a lantern and make her way to the coop, it was too late. 3 of her 6 chickens were dead. She stood in the doorway of the chicken coop, lantern light flickering across the scene of destruction, and felt despair settle over her. Those chickens represented not just food, but her only reliable source of protein through the winter months. The sound of running footsteps made her turn, and she saw Charles Rivera approaching through the snow, a rifle in his hands. "How bad?" he asked, breathing hard from his run. "3 dead," Rachel replied. "The others are alive but scared." Charles examined the coop quickly. "Big Tom probably weighs close to 150 pounds. He'll be back tomorrow night or the next." "What can I do?" "We can trap him, that is, if you are willing to let me help." Rachel looked at the destroyed coop, at her remaining chickens still trembling with terror. Her pride wanted to insist she could handle it herself, but her practical mind knew better. "What would you need me to do?" They worked together for the next hour, Charles explaining his plan while they prepared the trap. He would use one of her dead chickens as bait, positioning it where the cat would have to approach from a predictable direction. "You've done this before," she observed, "more times than I care to count. Mountain lions are getting bolder as their territory shrinks." "Are you from around here originally?" Charles paused. "I've been in these mountains for about 8 years. Came up from Colorado after I needed a change of scenery." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, a hint of old pain that Rachel recognized because she carried her own share of it. "I'll be watching from the ridge tonight," he said as they finished. "If the trap works, you'll hear the shot." "Thank you. I don't know how to repay this kindness." "No repayment needed. We look out for each other up here." The shot, when it came, was sharp and final in the cold air. Within an hour, she heard footsteps approaching. "It's done," Charles said simply. "The cat won't be bothering you or anyone else." Relief flooded through Rachel so powerfully that she had to sit down. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome. I'll dispose of the carcass tomorrow." His footsteps began to move away, but Rachel found herself calling out, "Charles, would you like to come in for coffee?" There was a long pause. "That's very kind of you, but I should get back. Maybe another time." "Of course, another time." But as she listened to his footsteps fade into the night, she found herself hoping that another time would come soon. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Rachel woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks. The constant anxiety about the mountain lion finally lifted. As Charles had promised, the cat's carcass was gone, and he had also reinforced the chicken coop with additional wire and wooden braces. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, she found herself watching for signs of her mysterious neighbor. Occasionally, she would see smoke rising from the direction of his cabin or catch a glimpse of him moving through the trees. He checked his snares regularly, and twice more he left split wood by her pile without being asked. The first real test of their developing acquaintance came in mid-October, when an early blizzard swept down from the high peaks with unexpected fury. Rachel had been caught outside when the storm hit, struggling to secure her chickens before they froze. As she sat by her fire afterward, trying to warm herself and listening to the storm rage outside, she heard something that made her heart skip, the sound of someone chopping wood nearby. Through the howling wind and driving snow, the rhythmic bite of an axe continued steadily. Charles Rivera was adding to her wood supply in the middle of one of the worst storms she had ever seen. When the chopping finally stopped, she saw him gathering an armload of freshly split wood and heading toward her cabin. This time, she didn't wait for him to knock. She opened the door as he approached. "You're going to freeze to death out there," she said as he stamped the snow off his boots. "Takes more than a little wind to bother me," Charles replied, but she could see that even he was affected by the storm. "Sit by the fire, I'll make coffee." Charles didn't argue, settling into the chair closest to the fireplace. Rachel busied herself with the coffee, stealing glances at him as she worked. This was the first time she had seen him clearly in good light. He appeared to be in his mid-30s with the kind of deep tan that spoke of years spent outdoors. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, and his beard was neatly trimmed. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he had spent a lot of time squinting into sun and wind. "You didn't have to come out in this storm," Rachel said as she handed him coffee. "Your wood supply was getting low. Storm like this could last 3 days. Didn't want you running short." The simple practicality of his concern touched her more than the elaborate gestures might have. "How did you know my wood was running low?" Charles smiled slightly. "I've been keeping an eye on your woodpile when I check the snares. Force of habit, I suppose. And you appointed yourself my guardian angel. More like your neighbor who happens to know something about surviving mountain winters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Rachel found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Where did you learn to read the weather so well?" she asked eventually. "My grandfather was a sheep herder in New Mexico. Spent summers with him when I was a boy. Learned to watch the sky. Saved my life more than once since I've been up here." "What brought you to these mountains?" Charles was quiet for so long that Rachel thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I was a deputy sheriff down in Colorado. Got involved in a situation that went bad, lost some people I cared about. Decided I needed to get away from that life for a while." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Rachel didn't push for more details. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It was a long time ago. What about you? Have you always lived up here?" "My father built this cabin when I was 12. He wanted to get away from people who stared and whispered. He thought the mountains would be kinder to me than the towns were." "Was he right?" Rachel considered the question seriously. "In some ways, yes. The mountains don't care if you walk with a limp. They're dangerous for everyone equally, and beautiful for everyone equally. But isolation has its own costs." "Loneliness," Charles said, understanding immediately. "Yes, and the practical difficulties of managing everything alone. Like dealing with mountain lions and securing wood supplies." "Exactly, I've managed, but it's been difficult." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Independence is important, but so is knowing when to accept help." "Is that what you're offering? Help?" "I'm offering to be a good neighbor. If that includes help when you need it, then yes." As the afternoon wore on, the storm began to show signs of weakening. Charles rose from his chair and reached for his coat. "I should head back before it gets dark." "Be careful. The trail will be treacherous." He paused at the door, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally, he turned back to face her. "Rachel, I want you to know that if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to use that bell by the creek. I mean that." "Thank you. The same goes for you." Charles smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "I'll remember that." The weeks that followed established a pattern of quiet cooperation that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Charles would appear when heavy work needed doing, always arriving without fanfare and departing with minimal conversation. Rachel, in turn, began leaving small offerings, fresh bread or jars of preserves tucked where he would find them during his rounds. It was a careful dance of mutual aid that respected both their need for independence and their growing appreciation for each other's company. The first real crack in Rachel's emotional armor came in early November, when she woke to find her water source frozen solid. The creek had been running lower than usual, and a particularly bitter night had locked it under thick ice. Without access to fresh water, her situation quickly became desperate. She spent the morning trying to break through the ice with an axe, but her awkward movements and limited strength made the task nearly impossible. By noon, she was exhausted, bruised, and no closer to reaching water than when she had started. Worse, the exertion had aggravated her leg to the point where she could barely walk. The sound of snowshoes crunching through the forest announced Charles's approach. He emerged from the trees carrying a pickaxe and wearing the expression of someone who had come prepared for exactly this problem. "Heard you working at the ice this morning," he said without preamble. "Figured you might need a hand." Within minutes, he had opened a hole large enough to fill buckets, then continued working, expanding the hole and constructing a small shelter around it to prevent it from freezing over again. "This should keep it open for a few days," he said, But if we get another hard freeze, it'll close up again. What then? Rachel asked, dreading the answer. Then I'll come back and open it again. Or you can ring the bell. The matter-of-fact way he offered ongoing help brought tears to Rachel's eyes. She turned away quickly, not wanting him to see her emotional response. But Charles had already noticed. Hey, he said gently, moving closer. What's wrong? Nothing. I'm just grateful, that's all. But Charles wasn't fooled. He crouched down beside her, bringing his eyes level with hers. It's more than that. What's really bothering you? The gentle concern in his voice broke through the last of Rachel's defenses. I hate being helpless. I hate needing rescue every time something goes wrong. I hate that I can't do simple things that any other person could manage without thinking about it. Charles listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're not helpless, he said finally. You're living alone in some of the most challenging country in the territory, managing a homestead and surviving conditions that would defeat most people. The fact that you occasionally need help with tasks that require brute strength doesn't make you weak. It feels like weakness. Different doesn't mean lesser. You found ways to accomplish what you need to accomplish. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who can't walk properly. Charles was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal experience. I've got my own limitations. Things I can't do, things I struggle with. We all do. The difference is that some limitations are visible and others aren't. What do you mean? Charles hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I can track a mountain lion for days and bring it down with a single shot, but I can't sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat from nightmares. I can build a shelter that will keep me alive in a blizzard, but I can't walk into a crowded room without my hands shaking. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Rachel studied his weathered face, seeing for the first time the carefully controlled tension that he carried. The situation in Colorado, it still affects you. Every day, some scars heal clean, others don't. I came up here because I needed space to figure out how to live with mine. Have you figured it out, I mean? I'm working on it. Some days are better than others. They sat together beside the flowing water, each lost in their own thoughts. Thank you, Rachel said finally, for telling me that and for helping with the water. Thank you for listening. It's been a while since I've talked about any of this with anyone. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, a shift from careful neighborliness to genuine friendship. Over the remaining weeks before winter set in earnest, they began spending more time together, sharing meals and conversation with increasing frequency. Charles proved to be an excellent cook, a skill he had learned during his years as a bachelor in the wilderness. In return, Rachel shared her knowledge of preserving and her skill with needle and thread, mending his worn clothing and teaching him to make repairs that would hold up under hard use. But it was the unspoken understanding between them that proved most valuable. Neither felt the need to pretend to be other than they were, to hide their struggles or put on false displays of strength. As November gave way to December and the first serious snows began to fall, Rachel realized that for the first time since her father's death, she was no longer truly alone. The invitation came in mid-December, delivered by young Tommy Henderson, who had made the treacherous journey up the valley on snowshoes. Mrs. Henderson was organizing a Christmas celebration at the schoolhouse, and everyone was invited to attend. Rachel accepted the folded paper with mixed feelings. Part of her longed for human company beyond her growing friendship with Charles. But another part dreaded the stares and whispered comments that her presence would inevitably provoke. Will you be going? Charles asked when she mentioned the invitation. I'm not sure. These gatherings can be difficult for me. Charles nodded, understanding immediately. People stare. People stare. People whisper. People either treat me like I'm made of glass or like I'm some kind of curiosity. It gets exhausting. What would you like to do? If none of that mattered, would you want to go? Rachel considered the question seriously. Yes, I think I would. I used to love music and dancing when I was younger, before I became so self-conscious. Then maybe you should go. Easy for you to say. Charles was quiet for a moment, then surprised her with his response. Actually, I was thinking of going myself. Rachel looked up sharply. Really? You don't seem like the type for community celebrations. I'm not, usually. But Mrs. Henderson made a point of stopping by my place personally. Apparently, the community has decided I'm not as much of a hermit as they thought. And you want to? Charles shrugged, but Rachel caught something in his expression that suggested the decision wasn't as casual as he was pretending. I've been thinking it might be time to try being around people again. See if I can manage it. What if you can't? What if the nightmares or the anxiety get too bad? Then I'll leave, but I won't know unless I try. The parallel between his situation and hers wasn't lost on Rachel. Both of them were contemplating stepping outside their carefully constructed comfort zones. We could go together, she suggested tentatively. If one of us needs to leave early, we both leave. No questions asked. Charles smiled. That sounds like a good plan. Mutual support. The Christmas celebration was scheduled for the Saturday before Christmas, giving them 2 weeks to prepare. For Rachel, preparation meant more than simply choosing what to wear. She needed to practice walking on icy streets, to build up her stamina for standing and moving for extended periods, and to prepare herself mentally for the social challenges ahead. Charles proved unexpectedly helpful in this preparation. He suggested exercises that might help improve her balance and endurance, and he helped her practice walking on different surfaces, clearing paths in the snow around her cabin. The key is to trust your body to find its own rhythm, he said as they worked together one afternoon. Don't try to walk like everyone else walks. Walk like Rachel walks. Rachel walks like a drunk sailor, she replied, frustrated, after a particularly awkward stumble. Rachel walks like someone who has learned to navigate the world on her own terms. Charles corrected gently. There's strength in that, even if it doesn't look conventional. As the day of the celebration approached, Rachel found herself growing increasingly nervous. She had sewn a new dress for the occasion, a simple but elegant design in deep blue wool that complemented her dark hair and fair skin. The day of the celebration dawned clear and cold, with brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like diamonds. Charles arrived at her cabin in mid-afternoon, driving a small sleigh pulled by a sturdy mountain horse. I thought this might be easier than walking, he said, helping her climb onto the seat beside him. The sleigh ride down the valley was magical, the runners whispering through the snow while the horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm. Rachel found herself relaxing despite her nervousness. Thank you for this, she said as they approached the outskirts of town. For coming with me, I mean. I don't think I would have had the courage to go alone. Thank you for giving me a reason to try. I've been hiding up in those mountains for 8 years. Maybe it's time to see if I remember how to be around people. The schoolhouse was already crowded when they arrived, warm light spilling from the windows and the sound of laughter carrying on the cold air. The moment they entered, conversations faltered and heads turned in their direction. Rachel felt the familiar flush of self-consciousness, but she forced herself to keep walking. Rachel Harris! Mrs. Henderson bustled over, her round face beaming with genuine pleasure. How wonderful that you could come. And Mr. Rivera, thank you so much for joining us. The warm welcome helped ease some of Rachel's tension, and she began to relax as Mrs. Henderson introduced them to other members of the community. Most people were kind, treating her with courtesy, though she caught occasional whispered comments and sideways glances. Charles, meanwhile, was clearly struggling with his own demons. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room as if looking for threats. But he stayed beside her, offering quiet support even as he battled his own discomfort. The evening progressed with food and conversation. Stories shared around the pot-bellied stove. Rachel found herself enjoying the warmth and camaraderie more than she had expected. But it was when the fiddle music started that everything changed. Old Henrik Johansson had brought his fiddle, the same instrument that had provided music for mountain gatherings for more than 20 years. The first notes that sang from its strings were hauntingly beautiful, a waltz that spoke of longing and hope in equal measure. Couples began forming on the small dance floor, moving together with easy grace. Rachel watched from her chair beside the stove, her heart aching with remembered joy. She had loved to dance when she was younger, before her self-consciousness had grown too strong to overcome. You're watching the dancers, Charles observed, settling into the chair beside hers. I used to dance, Rachel said wistfully, before I became so worried about what people would think. What would you think if you saw someone else dancing who moved differently than the others? Rachel considered the question. I suppose I'd think they were brave, that they were choosing joy over fear. Then maybe you should choose joy over fear. Before Rachel could respond, Charles rose from his chair and extended his hand toward her, just as he would 3 months later at the harvest celebration. But this time there was no crowd pressing close, no whispered comments or barely concealed mockery. I don't dance, Rachel whispered, the same words she would speak months later, but with less conviction this time. Neither do I, properly speaking, Charles replied. But I figure we might work something out together. Rachel looked at his outstretched hand, then at the faces around the room. Some people were watching with curiosity, others with what might have been disapproval, but many were simply focused on their own partners. What if I stumble? What if I make a fool of myself? Then we'll stumble together, and anyone who thinks less of you for trying isn't worth worrying about. With a deep breath that felt like stepping off a cliff, Rachel placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. Charles led her to a quiet corner of the dance floor. Just listen to the music, he said softly, placing one hand gently on her waist. Let it tell you how to move. The first few steps were awkward, Rachel's twisted leg making the traditional waltz steps nearly impossible. But Charles adapted immediately, shortening his stride and adjusting his movements to match her rhythm rather than forcing her to match his. Within moments, they had found a pattern that worked. You're doing beautifully, Charles murmured as they moved together. I feel like I'm going to fall. I won't let you fall. Trust me. And somehow, impossibly, Rachel did trust him. She stopped worrying about her footing and started listening to the music, letting it flow through her body and guide her movements. Charles's strong arms provided stability, while his quiet confidence gave her the courage to let go of her fear. They danced through the entire waltz and then through the polka that followed. With each dance, Rachel felt more confident, more joyful, more like the young woman she had been before shame had stolen her love of music and movement. How are you doing this? She asked during a brief pause between songs. You said you didn't dance. I said I didn't dance properly, Charles replied with a smile. But I've been watching you move for months now, learning your rhythm, understanding how you navigate the world. Dancing with you just means applying that knowledge to music. The insight took Rachel's breath away. Charles had been studying her movements, not with clinical curiosity, but with the careful attention of someone who cared enough to truly see her. Thank you, she whispered, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Thank you for trusting me. They danced until the evening wound down and other couples began to gather their coats. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson approached them with a warm smile. That was beautiful to watch, she said sincerely. You two moved together like you've been dancing for years. It felt that way, Rachel replied, surprising herself with her honesty. The sleigh ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The celebration had been a success beyond Rachel's wildest hopes. I'm glad we went, she said as they approached her cabin. So am I. It felt good to be around people again, even if it was challenging. Will you come in for coffee? I'm too excited to sleep right away. Charles helped her down from the sleigh and followed her into the warm cabin. As Rachel prepared coffee, he built up the fire. I have something to tell you, Charles said, as they settled into chairs by the fireplace. Something I should have mentioned earlier. Rachel looked up, hearing something serious in his tone. What is it? I've been offered the territorial marshal contacted me last month, asked if I'd be interested in taking a position as a deputy in the county seat. It would mean leaving the mountains, at least for part of the year. The news hit Rachel like a physical blow. Just when she had found companionship and hope, Charles was talking about leaving. Are you going to take it? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know. Part of me thinks it might be time to rejoin the world to see if I can use my skills to help people again. But part of me has grown to love this life, this place. What would help you decide? Charles looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes serious and searching, knowing whether I'd be leaving anything important behind. The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither had been brave enough to voice before. Rachel felt her heart racing as she realized that Charles was asking, in his careful way, whether their friendship had the potential to become something deeper. "You would be," she said quietly, "leaving something important behind. I mean, important enough to turn down the job?" Rachel met his eyes directly, drawing on the courage she had found on the dance floor. "That's not for me to decide, but I can tell you that these past few months have been the happiest I've known since my father died. Having you in my life has changed everything." Charles leaned forward in his chair, reaching out to take her hands in his. "For me too. I came up here to hide from the world, but you've made me want to be part of it again." "Then maybe the question isn't whether you should take the job. Maybe the question is whether we can build something together that's worth more than any job." The conversation continued late into the night, both of them finally giving voice to feelings they had been carefully guarding for months. By the time Charles finally prepared to leave, they had reached an understanding that would change both their lives. "I'm going to write to the marshal tomorrow," Charles said as he put on his coat. "I'm going to tell him that I've found something in these mountains that I'm not willing to give up." "Are you sure? I don't want you to sacrifice your future for me." "I'm not sacrificing anything," Charles replied, cupping her face gently in his hands. "Sarge, I'm choosing the future I want." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss that spoke of hope, impossibility, and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I should go," Charles said reluctantly, "but I'll be back tomorrow. We have a lot to talk about." After he left, Rachel sat by the dying fire, replaying the evening in her mind. The dance, the conversation, the kiss that had sealed their understanding. For the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility. Spring came late to the high country that year, with snow lingering in the shadowed valleys well into May. Rachel and Charles had spent the long winter months growing closer, their relationship deepening from friendship into something that felt as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. Charles had declined the marshal's job offer, choosing instead to expand his trapping operation. He had also begun filing a formal claim on his high country property with plans to build a larger cabin. The implications were clear to both of them, though they had not yet spoken formally of marriage. Their courtship was built on practical partnership and genuine understanding, on shared work and quiet conversations by the fire. Charles helped Rachel expand her garden and improve her chicken coop, while she mended his clothes and helped him prepare pelts for market. But it was the small gestures that meant the most to Rachel. The way Charles would appear with fresh meat when her supplies ran low, always presenting it as a fair trade rather than charity. The way he listened to her observations about weather patterns, treating her insights as valuable. The way he never once suggested that her disability made her less capable. Most importantly, he had continued to help her reclaim activities she had given up. They danced regularly now in the privacy of her cabin, with no audience but the fire and the wind outside. Charles had even fashioned a small wooden flute during the winter evenings, and he would play simple melodies while she moved to the music. "You should consider performing at the harvest celebration," Charles suggested one evening in late spring as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. "Performing?" Rachel laughed. "I'm not a performer. I'm just a woman who's learning to dance again." "You're a woman who moves with more grace and joy than most people who've never faced a physical challenge. There's beauty in what you do, Rachel. Beauty and courage that other people should see." "I don't think I'm ready for that kind of public attention." "Maybe not yet, but someday you might be." The conversation stayed with Rachel over the following weeks as spring turned towards summer and the mountain community began its annual cycle of gatherings. There would be a barn raising in June, a 4th of July picnic, and eventually the harvest celebration that marked the end of summer. Rachel found herself looking forward to these events in a way she never had before. Her experience at the Christmas dance had shown her that community acceptance was possible. Charles's steady support had given her the confidence to be herself in public. But not everyone in the mountain community had welcomed the changes in Rachel's social participation. There were whispers about the crippled Harris girl who had gotten above herself, suggestions that her relationship with the mysterious mountain man was somehow unseemly. Most of these comments came from a small group of women led by Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, the banker's wife who had moved to the mountains from back east. "It's not natural," Mrs. Whitmore was heard to say at the general store. "A woman like that, thinking she can dance and carry on like she's normal. And that man of hers encouraging such behavior." The comments might have remained harmless gossip if not for the arrival of Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, Dennis Lopez, a young man from Denver who had come to spend the summer in the mountains while recovering from what his family called nervous exhaustion. Dennis had the kind of cruel humor that found entertainment in the misfortunes of others. Rachel's first encounter with Dennis came at the barn raising in June, where she had volunteered to help with the cooking while Charles worked with the other men. She was carrying a heavy pot of stew when Dennis deliberately stepped into her path, causing her to stumble and nearly drop the pot. "Careful there," he said with mock concern, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself trying to do things you're not equipped for." Rachel felt her face burn with humiliation as several people turned to stare. She managed to keep hold of the pot and continued to the serving table. But the damage was done. Charles appeared at her side moments later, his expression dark with anger. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Rachel replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Charles looked across the gathering to where Dennis was laughing with a group of young men, clearly enjoying the reaction his joke had provoked. For a moment, Rachel thought Charles might confront him directly, but instead he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't let him steal your joke," he said quietly. "He's not worth it." But Dennis wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, he seemed to make a game of finding ways to embarrass Rachel in public. He would make loud comments about her unsteady gait when she walked past, or offer exaggerated assistance with tasks she was perfectly capable of managing alone. The harassment came to a head at the 4th of July picnic, when Dennis had been drinking and his behavior became even more aggressive. Rachel was sitting with a group of women when Dennis approached with several of his friends. "Ladies," he said with exaggerated politeness, "I was wondering if Miss Harris might favor us with a demonstration of her dancing skills. I've heard so much about her unique style." The cruel emphasis made his meaning clear, and Rachel felt the familiar flush of shame and anger. "I don't think that's necessary," said Mrs. Henderson diplomatically. "Oh, but I insist," Dennis continued, his voice growing louder. "After all, if Miss Harris is going to parade her talents at public gatherings, surely she won't mind giving us a proper show." Rachel started to rise from her chair, intending to leave rather than subject herself to further humiliation. But Dennis moved to block her path. "Going somewhere, but we haven't had our entertainment yet." It was then that Charles appeared, moving through the crowd with quiet intensity. He didn't say a word, but something in his expression made Dennis take a step backward. "Is there a problem here?" Charles asked, his voice deadly quiet. "No problem at all," Dennis replied, trying to maintain his bravado but clearly unsettled. "Just asking Miss Harris to share her dancing talents." "I think Miss Harris has shared enough for one day," Charles said, extending his hand to help Rachel to her feet. "And I think you have entertained yourself enough at her expense." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Mrs. Whitmore chose that moment to intervene, calling her nephew away with sharp words. Dennis retreated, but not before shooting a look of pure malice at both Rachel and Charles. "This isn't over," he said quietly, the words meant only for them to hear. As they walked away from the picnic, Rachel felt the weight of the community's stares following them. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, but too many showed uncomfortable fascination. "I'm sorry," Charles said. "I should have handled that differently." "How? By letting him continue to mock me?" "By not letting it get to that point in the first place." Rachel shook her head, feeling suddenly exhausted. "You can't protect me from everyone who finds my disability amusing, and I can't hide away just because some people are cruel." "What do you want to do?" Rachel looked back at the picnic, at the people who were still stealing glances in their direction, and made a decision. "I want to go to the harvest celebration," she said firmly. "I want to dance, and I want to show Dennis Lopez and everyone else that I won't be driven away by cruelty." "Are you sure? It might be difficult." "I'm sure, but I'll need your help." Charles took her hands in his dark eyes serious and determined. "You'll have it, whatever you need." They spent the rest of the summer preparing for what they both knew would be a crucial test. Charles helped Rachel practice her dancing until she moved with confidence and grace that transcended her physical limitations. More importantly, he helped her prepare mentally for the confrontation they both knew was coming. Remember, he told her the night before the harvest celebration, "You're not dancing for them. You're dancing for yourself, for the joy of it. Let that be enough. And if they laugh, if Dennis makes another scene, then we'll deal with it together, but don't let the fear of their laughter keep you from claiming your joy." As Rachel prepared for bed that night, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From the isolated, bitter woman who had been afraid to leave her cabin, to someone who was willing to face public mockery for the chance to dance. Tomorrow would bring the harvest celebration, and with it, the moment of truth that would determine whether love and courage were enough to overcome cruelty and prejudice. Rachel fell asleep with Charles's words echoing in her mind. "You move perfectly with me." The harvest celebration dawned crisp and clear, with perfect autumn weather that made the mountains seem to glow with inner light. The aspens had turned golden, creating a stunning backdrop for the festivities, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter's approach. Rachel woke early, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. Charles arrived in the early afternoon, bringing with him a sense of calm confidence that helped settle her nerves. He had dressed carefully for the occasion in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly trimmed and his beard freshly groomed. "You look beautiful," he said as she emerged from the cabin, wearing the dress she had made for the Christmas celebration. "I look terrified," Rachel replied. "That too," Charles agreed with a gentle smile. "But beautiful terrified, if that helps." They made the journey to the valley in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The celebration was being held in a natural amphitheater formed by a bend in the creek, with a level area perfect for dancing, surrounded by rising slopes where spectators could sit and watch. By the time they arrived, the festivities were already in full swing. Tables laden with food stretched along one side of the clearing, while musicians tuned their instruments near a makeshift stage. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the general atmosphere of celebration. Rachel felt the familiar tightening in her chest as heads turned in their direction, but this time she forced herself to stand straight and meet the curious gazes directly. She was here by right, as much a member of this community as anyone else. "Rachel! Charles!" Mrs. Henderson hurried over, her face beaming with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful to see you both." The warm welcome helped ease some of Rachel's tension, and she found herself relaxing as they moved through the gathering. Most people greeted them with courtesy and kindness, and several made a point of complimenting Rachel on her appearance. But she was acutely aware of Dennis Lopez's presence, watching from across the clearing with predatory attention. He had gathered a small group of followers around him, young men who seemed to find his crude humor entertaining. The afternoon passed peacefully enough, with games and contests and easy socializing. Rachel helped with the children's activities as Mrs. Henderson had requested, finding joy in their uncomplicated acceptance of her differences. As evening approached and the musicians began to set up for the dancing portion of the celebration, Rachel felt her nervousness return in full force. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the test that would determine whether she could truly reclaim her place in the community. Charles appeared at her side as the first notes of music drifted across the clearing. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "As ready as I'll ever be," Rachel replied, accepting his offered arm. They moved toward the dance area as other couples began to form, and Rachel was gratified to see several people smile and nod in their direction. But she was also aware of Dennis Lopez rising from his seat on the hillside, his expression sharp with malicious anticipation. The first dance was a simple waltz, and Rachel and Charles moved into it with the confidence born of months of practice. They had found their rhythm immediately, Charles's strong lead compensating for Rachel's uneven gait, while her natural grace transformed their partnership into something beautiful to watch. For the first few minutes, everything went perfectly. The music was lovely, the evening air was soft and warm, and Rachel felt the pure joy of movement and music flowing through her body. She caught glimpses of people watching from the sidelines, and most of the faces showed appreciation rather than mockery. But then Dennis Lopez began his campaign of harassment in earnest. It started subtly, with loud comments to his friends that were clearly meant to be overheard. "Look at that," he said with exaggerated wonder. "She actually thinks she's dancing. How quaint." His friends laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the evening air, and Rachel felt her confidence begin to waver. Charles's grip on her hand tightened reassuringly, and he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Ignore them. Focus on the music." Rachel tried to follow his advice, but Dennis wasn't finished. As the waltz ended and couples repositioned themselves for the next dance, he rose from his seat and began to make his way down the hillside toward the dance area. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire gathering, "I believe we're about to witness something truly special. A demonstration of, shall we call it interpretive dance?" The cruel laughter that followed his words made Rachel's cheeks burn with humiliation. She started to pull away from Charles, ready to flee rather than subject herself to further public mockery, but he held her gently but firmly in place. "Stay," he said quietly. "Don't let him win." Dennis had reached the edge of the dance area now, and he began an exaggerated pantomime of Rachel's walking style, lurching and stumbling in a grotesque parody that sent his followers into fits of laughter. Other people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the display, but uncertain how to respond. "Perhaps Miss Harris would favor us with a solo performance," Dennis continued, his voice dripping with false solicitude. "After all, it would be such a shame to deprive the community of such unique entertainment." The words hit Rachel like physical blows, each one designed to strip away the confidence she had worked so hard to build. She felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes, and the familiar desire to hide, to disappear, to never again subject herself to such cruelty washed over her with overwhelming force. But then she heard Charles's voice, quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathering. "You're right," he said, addressing Dennis directly. "Rachel's dancing is unique. It's also beautiful, courageous, and more graceful than anything you will ever accomplish in your miserable life." Dennis's face flushed with anger at the unexpected challenge. "Are you defending this spectacle, this mockery of normal human movement?" "I'm defending a woman who has more courage in her little finger than you have in your entire body," Charles replied, his voice deadly quiet. "A woman who chooses joy over bitterness, who faces the world with dignity despite the cruelty of small-minded fools like you." The confrontation had drawn the attention of the entire gathering now, and Rachel could feel hundreds of eyes focused on the drama unfolding before them. Part of her wanted to beg Charles to stop, to avoid making the situation worse, but another part of her was grateful beyond words that someone was finally standing up to Dennis's bullying. "Courage?" Dennis laughed harshly. "What courage does it take to stumble around and call it dancing? What dignity is there in making a public fool of yourself?" "The courage to live fully despite physical limitations," Charles replied. "The dignity that comes from refusing to hide away because others might find your differences uncomfortable. The strength to claim your place in the world despite people like you who try to make you feel ashamed of who you are." Dennis's face had gone red with fury, and Rachel could see that Charles's words had struck home. But instead of backing down, Dennis chose to escalate the confrontation. "Well then," he said with malicious glee, "let's see just how courageous and dignified your crippled girlfriend really is. Come on, Rachel. Show us all how beautifully you can dance. Show us this grace and courage your defender claims to see." The challenge hung in the air like a sword, and Rachel felt the weight of every eye in the gathering focused on her. This was the moment she had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure, the test that would determine whether she could truly overcome the shame and fear that had controlled her life for so long. Charles turned to her, his dark eyes filled with love and confidence and unwavering support. "Rachel," he said, just as he had months earlier during their first dance, "you move perfectly with me." And in that moment, standing in the center of a hostile crowd with cruel laughter echoing in her ears, Rachel Harris made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Rachel looked around the circle of faces surrounding her, seeing the mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and uncomfortable fascination that Dennis's cruelty had provoked. Some people looked away when she met their eyes, embarrassed by the scene they were witnessing. Others leaned forward with morbid interest, but scattered throughout the crowd, she also saw faces that showed genuine support. Mrs. Henderson was watching with tears in her eyes and her hands clasped tightly in front of her heart. Old Henrik Johansson had his fiddle ready, waiting to see what she would choose. Several of the women she had worked with during the afternoons at activities were nodding encouragingly. "Well," Dennis demanded, his voice sharp with impatience, "are we going to see this legendary grace, or are you going to run away like the coward you are?" The word coward hit Rachel like a slap, but instead of crushing her spirit, it ignited something fierce and defiant in her chest. She had been called many things over the years: crippled, pitiful, broken, damaged. But she had never been a coward. She had survived the death of her parents, carved out a life in the harsh mountain wilderness, and built a relationship with a man who saw her worth despite her limitations. Whatever else she might be, she was not a coward. "Henrik," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering, "would you play something for me? Something with a strong rhythm that I can follow." The old musician's weathered face broke into a broad grin, and he raised his fiddle to his shoulder without hesitation. "What would you like, child?" "Something beautiful," Rachel replied, taking Charles's hand and moving with him to the center of the dance area. "Something that speaks of joy despite hardship, of beauty that persists despite cruelty." Henrik nodded and began to play, the notes of an old Norwegian folk tune flowing from his instrument like liquid gold. It was a melody Rachel had never heard before, but somehow it spoke to her soul, telling a story of resilience and hope that matched her own journey. Charles placed his hand gently on her waist and took her other hand in his, just as he had during their first dance months earlier. But this time, there was no hesitation in Rachel's movements, no self-consciousness about who might be watching. She had found her courage at last, and she was ready to claim her joy in front of the entire world. They began to move together, their bodies finding the rhythm of the music with the ease of long practice. Charles led with subtle strength, his movements perfectly calibrated to support and complement her unique gait. Rachel followed with growing confidence, her natural grace emerging as she stopped fighting her limitations and started dancing with them. The modified waltz they had developed over months of practice was unlike anything the mountain community had ever seen. It wasn't the conventional ballroom dancing that most couples performed with its rigid steps and formal patterns. Instead, it was something entirely new, a style of movement that acknowledged Rachel's physical differences while transforming them into something beautiful. Where a traditional waltz might call for quick, precise footwork, Rachel and Charles had developed flowing movements that emphasized the upper body and the connection between partners. Where conventional dancing required perfect symmetry, their style celebrated the unique rhythm that Rachel's gait created, turning what others saw as a limitation into the foundation of something graceful and moving. As they danced, something magical began to happen. The cruel laughter that had greeted Dennis's mockery faded away, replaced by a hushed attention that spoke of genuine appreciation. People began to lean forward, drawn into the beauty of what they were witnessing, and Rachel could see wonder replacing mockery in many of the faces around her. Mrs. Henderson was openly weeping now, her hands pressed to her heart as she watched Rachel reclaim her joy in such a public and courageous way. Several other women had joined her, moved by the sight of someone refusing to be diminished by cruelty. Even some of the men who had been laughing at Dennis's jokes earlier were now watching with expressions of respect and admiration. But it was the children's reactions that touched Rachel most deeply. They had gathered at the edge of the dance area, their faces bright with delight as they watched the pretty lady and the mountain man move together in their special way. To them, there was nothing strange or pitiable about Rachel's dancing. It was simply beautiful, different in a way that made it more interesting rather than less worthy. Henrik's fiddle sang through the mountain air, the melody rising and falling like the landscape around them, and Rachel felt herself becoming part of the music in a way she had never experienced before. Her body moved with increasing confidence, her spirit soaring as she realized that she was not just surviving this public test, she was triumphing over it. Charles's eyes never left her face as they danced, his expression showing the kind of love and pride that made her feel beautiful and worthy and whole. In his arms, moving to Henrik's exquisite music. She was not a disabled woman trying to pretend she could dance normally. She was simply Rachel, dancing her own dance, claiming her own joy, refusing to be diminished by the cruelty of those who couldn't see past her differences. The music built to a crescendo, and Rachel found herself spinning in Charles's arms, her skirts flaring around her as she moved with abandon. The movement should have been impossible given her twisted leg, but somehow Charles's support and her own determination made it work, creating a moment of pure beauty that took the breath away from everyone watching. As the final notes of Henrik's tune faded into the mountain evening, Rachel and Charles came to rest in the center of the dance area, both breathing hard from their exertion, but glowing with the joy of shared accomplishment. For a moment, the entire gathering was silent, as if no one wanted to break the spell that had been woven by their performance. Then Henrik began to clap, his weathered hands creating a rhythm that was quickly taken up by Mrs. Henderson, then by the children, then by more and more of the adults until the entire hillside rang with applause. People rose to their feet, their faces showing genuine appreciation and respect, and Rachel felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Beautiful," called out Mrs. Henderson. "Absolutely beautiful." "More," shouted one of the children. "Dance some more." Even some of the men who had been part of Dennis's cruel audience were now applauding, their earlier mockery replaced by grudging admiration for Rachel's courage and grace. The transformation in the crowd's mood was remarkable, as if witnessing Rachel's triumph had awakened something better in their own hearts. But Dennis Lopez was not finished. His face was twisted with fury at seeing his cruel entertainment transformed into something that celebrated, rather than humiliated, his intended victim. As the applause continued, he pushed forward through the crowd, his voice raised in desperate anger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're all applauding a cripple stumbling around. There's nothing beautiful about it. It's pathetic." The applause faltered and died as people turned to stare at Dennis in shock. His words were so crude, so obviously motivated by malice, that even those who might have been uncomfortable with Rachel's differences were appalled by his response. "That's enough," said a voice from the crowd, and Rachel was surprised to see that it belonged to Mr. Whitmore, Dennis's own uncle. The banker's face was red with embarrassment and anger as he approached his nephew. "You've disgraced yourself and our family with this behavior. Apologize to Miss Harris immediately." "I will not apologize for speaking the truth," Dennis replied, his voice shrill with defiance. "Just because you are all too polite to say it doesn't mean we should pretend that watching a cripple try to dance is anything other than a sad spectacle." The ugly word hung in the air like a curse, and Rachel felt its familiar sting. But this time, instead of crushing her spirit, it seemed to strengthen her resolve. She had faced her worst fear, public mockery and humiliation, and not only survived it, but transformed it into something beautiful. Dennis's continued cruelty could no longer touch her in the same way. Charles, however, was not as philosophical about the insult. He stepped forward, his face dark with controlled fury, and for a moment Rachel thought he might actually strike Dennis down where he stood. "You will apologize," Charles said, his voice deadly quiet, "or you will leave. Those are your only choices." "And if I refuse both," Dennis challenged, apparently too angry to recognize the danger he was courting. "Then I will make the choice for you," Charles replied, and something in his tone made Dennis take an involuntary step backward. Mr. Whitmore intervened before the confrontation could escalate further, grabbing his nephew's arm and pulling him away from the dance area. "That's enough, Dennis. We're leaving, now." "This isn't over," Dennis called back as his uncle dragged him toward their wagon. "You can't make people pretend that freak is normal just because you're willing to humiliate yourself by associating with her." The word freak was the final straw for many in the crowd. Several men started forward, their faces showing the kind of anger that comes from witnessing deliberate cruelty towards someone who had shown nothing but courage and grace. But Charles held up a hand, stopping them before they could reach Dennis. "Let him go," Charles said firmly. "He's shown everyone here exactly what kind of man he is. That's punishment enough." As the Whitmore's wagon disappeared into the gathering darkness, the crowd began to settle back into the celebration mood. But the atmosphere had been changed by the confrontation. People seemed more thoughtful, more aware of the courage it had taken for Rachel to dance in public, despite knowing she might face exactly the kind of cruelty Dennis had displayed. Henrik raised his fiddle again, beginning a gentle melody that invited other couples to join the dancing. Several pairs moved onto the dance area, but they made sure to leave space for Rachel and Charles, acknowledging their right to be there as equals rather than objects of curiosity. "Are you all right?" Charles asked quietly as they prepared to dance again. "I'm more than all right," Rachel replied, and she meant it. "I'm free." They danced until the stars came out, and the evening grew too cold for outdoor festivities. And with each dance, Rachel felt more confident, more joyful, more completely herself. The community had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen to celebrate rather than mock her courage. Dennis's cruelty had been exposed and rejected, while her own grace and determination had been recognized and applauded. As they prepared to leave the celebration, Mrs. Henderson approached them with tears still glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for showing us what real courage looks like." "Thank you for giving me the chance to define it," Rachel replied. The ride home through the moonlit mountain landscape was quiet and peaceful, both Rachel and Charles lost in their own thoughts about the evening's events. The confrontation with Dennis had been difficult, but its resolution had been more complete and satisfying than either of them had dared to hope. "Do you think he'll cause more trouble?" Rachel asked as they approached her cabin. "Not here," Charles replied. His uncle was genuinely ashamed of his behavior. "I suspect Dennis will find himself on the next stage back to Denver." They sat on her porch for a while after Charles unhitched the horse, neither wanting to end the evening quite yet. The celebration had marked more than just Rachel's triumph over public mockery. It had also been a declaration of their partnership, a public acknowledgement of their commitment to each other. "I have something to ask you," Charles said finally, his voice carrying a nervousness that was unusual for him. Rachel looked up, seeing something serious and hopeful in his expression. "What is it?" Charles rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with gentle reverence. "Rachel Harris, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal was simple and direct, without elaborate speeches or flowery declarations, and it was perfect for both of them. Rachel felt her heart soar with joy as she looked into the face of the man who had seen past her limitations to the woman beneath, who had helped her reclaim her courage and her joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Charles Rivera, I will marry you." He kissed her then, a kiss that spoke of love and commitment and shared dreams for the future. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling through tears of happiness. "When?" Rachel asked. "As soon as we can arrange it. I've waited 8 years to find someone worth sharing my life with. I don't want to wait any longer than necessary." They talked late into the night, making plans for their wedding and their future together. Charles would expand his cabin to accommodate both of them, while Rachel would continue to maintain her father's property as a retreat and workspace. They would build their life together in the mountains they both loved, surrounded by a community that had learned to see past differences to the courage and grace beneath. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, with the aspen leaves creating a golden canopy overhead. The entire mountain community attended, from old Henrik with his fiddle to the youngest children who had been so delighted by Rachel's dancing. Even Mr. Whitmore came, having sent his nephew back to Denver as Charles had predicted. Mrs. Henderson had organized the celebration with military precision, transforming the schoolhouse into a bower of autumn flowers and evergreen boughs. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, conducted by the traveling preacher who made his rounds through the mountain settlements twice a year. But it was the dancing afterward that everyone would remember. Rachel wore a new dress of deep green silk that Charles had ordered specially from Denver, and she moved with a confidence and joy that illuminated her face and transformed her into something radiant. Their first dance as husband and wife was the same modified waltz they had perfected over months of practice, but now it carried additional meaning as a celebration of their partnership and commitment. Other couples joined them on the dance floor, but Rachel noticed that several had begun to incorporate elements of the style she and Charles had developed. The rigid formality of traditional ballroom dancing was giving way to something more personal and expressive, as if her example had given others permission to find their own ways of moving to music. "Look," Charles murmured as they danced, nodding toward a young couple who were experimenting with movements that accommodated the woman's pronounced limp from a childhood injury. You've started something. Rachel watched as the couple found their own rhythm, their own way of moving together that honored both their abilities and limitations. The woman's face glowed with the same joy Rachel had discovered in her own dancing, and her partner's expression showed the kind of pride and love that comes from helping someone else find their confidence. Maybe that's what courage really is, Rachel said thoughtfully. Not the absence of fear or limitation, but the willingness to find beauty and joy despite them. And the willingness to share that beauty with others, Charles added, even when it means risking mockery or rejection. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the isolated, bitter woman who had been afraid to leave her cabin, to a wife and partner who could dance with joy in front of her entire community. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been complete. She would always walk with a limp, would always face challenges that others took for granted. But she had learned that limitations didn't have to define her, that difference didn't mean lesser, that courage could be found in the choice to live fully despite the risks. She had found love with a man who saw her worth rather than her weaknesses, and together they had built something beautiful from the raw materials of their individual struggles. Most importantly, she had discovered that her own healing could become a source of healing for others. By refusing to hide her differences, by insisting on her right to participate fully in community life, she had given permission for others to do the same. Years later, when visitors to the mountain community remarked on the unusual warmth and acceptance they found there, longtime residents would trace it back to that October evening when Rachel Harris Rivera chose courage over fear, joy over shame, and in doing so changed not just her own life, but the hearts of all who witnessed her triumph. 5 years later, on another crisp autumn evening, Rachel stood at the window of the expanded cabin she shared with Charles, watching the sun set behind the peaks that had become the backdrop for a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever imagined possible. The cabin now boasted a large room specifically designed for dancing lessons, with mirrors along one wall and a piano that Charles had somehow managed to transport up the mountain as a gift for their third anniversary. The room was rarely empty these days. Word of Rachel's teaching had spread beyond their immediate community, drawing students from as far away as Denver and Colorado Springs. They came seeking not just dance instruction, but something deeper, the kind of acceptance and encouragement that allowed people to find beauty in their own unique ways of moving through the world. Some of her students were like herself, dealing with physical limitations that made conventional dancing impossible. Others were simply people who had been told they were too clumsy, too awkward, too different to participate in activities that brought joy to others. Rachel worked with each of them individually, helping them discover their own rhythm, their own grace, their own way of expressing the music that lived within their hearts. The first rule of dancing, Rachel would tell new students, is that there is no wrong way to move if you're moving with joy. The second rule is that everyone has their own rhythm. Our job is to help you find yours. The lessons had become more than just instruction in movement. They had evolved into a form of community building, creating connections between people who might otherwise have remained isolated by their differences. Charles had proven to be more than just a supportive husband. He had become an integral part of the teaching process, his patient strength providing stability and encouragement for students who were learning to trust their bodies in new ways. The financial success of the teaching had allowed them to improve their property and their lives in ways that would have been impossible through farming and trapping alone. But more importantly, it had given Rachel a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal fulfillment. She was making a difference in people's lives, helping them discover their own worth and beauty in a world that too often emphasized conformity over individuality. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Rachel smiled as she recognized the familiar pattern. 3 short raps, followed by 2 longer ones, the signal she and Charles had established for students who were nervous about their first lesson. She opened the door to find a middle-aged man standing on her porch, his hat in his hands and his expression showing the mixture of hope and fear that she had learned to recognize in new students. Behind him stood a woman of similar age, clearly his wife, whose face showed the kind of protective concern that spoke of long experience with her husband's struggles. "Mrs. Rivera?" the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm James Mitchell, and this is my wife, Sarah. We've traveled from Grand Junction to see you. We heard, we heard that you might be able to help. Rachel's trained eye quickly assessed the situation. James Mitchell stood with the careful balance of someone dealing with a neurological condition, his left hand showing the telltale tremor of Parkinson's disease or a similar disorder. Please come in, Rachel said warmly, stepping aside to welcome them into her home. Let's sit by the fire and talk about what brought you all this way. As the Mitchells settled into chairs by the fireplace, their story emerged in halting pieces. James had been a successful businessman in Grand Junction, active in his community and known for his love of social dancing. But the onset of his neurological condition had gradually robbed him of his coordination and confidence, forcing him to withdraw from activities that had once brought him joy. The doctors say the tremor will only get worse, James said, his voice heavy with resignation. They've told me to accept that my dancing days are over. But he misses it so much, Sarah added, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Dancing was how we met, how we courted, how we celebrated every important moment in our lives. Watching him give up something he loves so deeply has been heartbreaking. Rachel listened with the patience born of experience, recognizing in the Mitchell story echoes of her own journey from despair to hope. What would you like to accomplish here? Rachel asked gently. What would success look like to you? James looked at his wife, then back at Rachel, his expression showing a vulnerability that spoke of deep longing, carefully guarded against disappointment. I want to dance with Sarah again, he said simply. Not perfectly, not like we used to, but somehow. I want to feel that connection to the music and to her that dancing always gave us. Rachel smiled, recognizing the same fierce determination that had driven her own journey from isolation to joy. Then let's see what we can do. Charles, would you put on some music, something gentle to start with? What followed was the same process Rachel had undergone years earlier, the careful exploration of what was possible rather than dwelling on what was lost. James's tremor made traditional dance holds impossible, but Rachel quickly identified ways to modify their connection that provided stability without requiring fine motor control. By the end of their first session, James and Sarah were moving together with a joy that illuminated both their faces. The movements were different from their previous dancing, adapted to accommodate James's condition, but the essential connection was still there. How do you do it? Sarah asked as they prepared to leave, her voice full of wonder. How do you help people find hope when everything seems lost? Rachel considered the question seriously, thinking back over the years of teaching and the hundreds of students who had passed through her dancing room. I think it's because I remember what it felt like to believe that my differences made me less worthy of joy, she said finally. I remember the isolation, the shame, the conviction that I would never be able to participate fully in life because my body didn't work the way other people's bodies worked. And what changed? James asked. I learned that the problem wasn't with my body, it was with my understanding of what it meant to be whole. I thought wholeness meant perfection, conformity, the absence of struggle or limitation. But real wholeness comes from accepting yourself completely, limitations and all, and finding ways to live joyfully within whatever constraints you face. The Mitchells stayed for a week, taking daily lessons and gradually building both skill and confidence. By the time they left, they had not only reclaimed their ability to dance together, but had also connected with other students dealing with similar challenges. As Rachel watched their carriage disappear down the mountain trail, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened, isolated woman who had once hidden in her cabin, ashamed of her differences and convinced of her unworthiness, had been transformed into someone who could offer hope and healing to others facing similar struggles. Charles appeared beside her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist as they watched the sun complete its descent behind the mountains. Another success story, he asked. Another reminder that we all have the capacity for healing, Rachel replied, both giving it and receiving it. Do you ever regret the path that brought us here? The struggles, the pain, the years of isolation? Rachel considered the question seriously, thinking about the young woman she had been and the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. No, she said finally, I don't regret any of it. Every struggle taught me something I needed to know. Every moment of pain or shame led me toward greater understanding and compassion. And if you could go back and change things, make yourself whole from the beginning? Rachel smiled, understanding the deeper question he was asking. I am whole, Charles. I've always been whole. It just took me a long time to understand what wholeness really means. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of music drifted from the dancing room where two of Rachel's current students were practicing. The music was the same Norwegian folk tune that Henrik had played 5 years earlier when Rachel had first found the courage to dance in public. Come, Rachel said, taking Charles's hand and leading him toward the dancing room. Let's dance. They moved together with the easy grace of long practice and deep love, their bodies finding the familiar rhythm that had sustained them through years of partnership. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but within the circle of their embrace, everything was movement and music and joy. Rachel Harris Rivera danced with her husband in the home they had built together, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from broken to whole, from hidden to celebrated, from ashamed to proud. She had learned to dance despite her limp, but more importantly, she had learned to live fully despite her fears. And in learning that lesson, she had become a teacher for all who struggled with the courage to be themselves in a world that too often demanded conformity. Her legacy would live on in every student who found their own rhythm, every couple who learned to move together despite their differences, every person who chose joy over shame and dancing over hiding. She moved perfectly with him, just as he had promised she always would, and in that movement was the proof that love, courage, and acceptance could transform any limitation into a source of strength, any difference into a celebration, any dance into a prayer of gratitude for the gift of being fully, completely, joyfully alive.